Before we officially start, I want to make it clear that I am, or rather was, an English major. I technically know a lot of the official terms we use to discuss literature, but do you want to know a little secret? I forget a lot of them, a lot of the time, and that's okay. First off, there's the internet, which allows me answers for what I'm looking for. Secondly, and more importantly, for any of you guys who might be a little nervous to join in conversations if you don't have all the vocabulary, is that we can participate in conversations about literature without needing to know all the terms. So let's get started. I'm learning as I go along, so let's start with a summary of the book All the Light We Cannot See. We follow a few characters through World War II. There are some side characters, specifically a Nazi official, that gets some focus away from what could be considered the two main characters. The first main character is Marie-Laure LeBlanc, a blind teen in France. The second is Werner Fennig, a German teen who starts out in Germany and ends up in France with the German military. And then the Nazi, Sergeant Major Reinhold von Rumpel, who has cancer which gives him a limp. Because of the way the book is written, it bounces around in time, but the plot is roughly this. Marie-Laure, blind, gemstone, uncle, resistance, France, twice. Werner, poor radio nut, Hitler Youth probably, war, France. Yes, short and clipped, har har. I do think I'm funny. Sometimes. But knowing the plot in depth is not super important to the points of discussion for this video. Switching times and points of view. That's what POV stands for, by the way, if that acronym isn't familiar to you. Before I poke too hard, I want to point out that I keep reading people describe the writing of this book as lyrical, which I understand and agree with. There is a variety of chapter lengths and a focus on the word choice and writing style that make it feel like a book-length prose poem. To define, prose is paragraph writing, the standard writing type basically. This style of writing likely added to my frustration surrounding getting into this book. It was a little more difficult than usual for me to fall into the groove of it, knowing which character I was reading and what time they were at in history. I had to keep looking back at the section title pages to double check what year I was on, especially considering the years were so close together. I couldn't help but compare it to a previous time-skip double main character book that I read, A Long Walk to Water by Linda Sue Park, which incidentally could also be part of the conversation of the third section I'm going to cover, but that is going to be a different video, I think. Let me demonstrate with a comparison between the two books. All the Light We Cannot See. Sections that set a year and sometimes a specific date, with chapters within that vary in length. Each section is a different time, each chapter a different person with no difference in style of writing. Meant to be lyrical. A Long Walk to Water. Chapters are standard 1, 2, 3, etc. Every switch between character POV is labeled with location and year. Each character has their own font and font color, but since the fonts are different, even without the color you can tell them apart. I'm not quite sure how to end this section, but given I'm calling these things reading for writers, I ought to say something about writing. It can be easy to get so familiar with your story that you know exactly where you are with the characters. Readers who are just coming in aren't going to have that familiarity. With writing time skips, especially in combination with two main characters like this, you might know exactly what's happening, but a reader might not. There are times to ignore the possibility of an audience for ease of writing, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't get feedback from an audience. This is one of those times to get feedback from readers, especially before properly publishing a piece. Speaking about listening to your readers, arguably the most important readers to ask about this book are the blind and vision impaired, since the main character is part of that community. Surface-level observations about the character of Marie-Laure bring about frustrations regarding inaccuracies about her navigation of the world. Adventures in Low Vision's review in particular states, "The book offers peaceful prose, but does not sit gently for long. A few things kept poking my psyche days after I finished reading it, such as, counting steps to navigate is not effective. I wish that trope would die." And they were not the only one who pointed this out. Molly Faerber's review does step back to consider, "If she travels alone less frequently than many blind people today, I was willing to cite the dangers of wartime and the conventions of the period." But Faerber takes further consideration of the character and writes, "Another perplexing point was the absence of Marie-Laure's feelings about her blindness, or any discussion of her identity as a person who is blind. Granted, that isn't what this novel is about, and in some sense I see that as a remarkable achievement. Here's a novel about a brave and intelligent character who happens to be blind." Yet, as a person who becomes blind during childhood, Marie-Laure must necessarily have feelings about that journey, on a personal level and in terms of how she relates to society and her place within it. These details could always be chalked up to quirks of the character, but these are not the only things about Marie-Laure that have been issues. Arguably, the biggest issue is that of the character's agency. From the National Institutes of Health, the sense of agency refers to the feeling of control over actions and their consequences. In other words, and connecting it back to Marie-Laure, it would be her being able to control her own life. In Anthony Doe on Blindness and the Portrayal of Marie-Laure, Sheri Wells-Jensen points out that the assault on the dignity of blind people is not that this character has strange adaptive techniques, or even that there are so many things she does not do for herself. It is that she is utterly without agency as a character. Marie does not even pack her own clothes, not because she can't find her bedroom or doesn't know her socks from her pantaloons, but because she is simply not expected to do that sort of thing. And while not blind, a member of the disability community, Library of Dreaming, writes on her Chronically Iconic Book Club about this book with a title that caught my eye: Why I No Longer Recommend All the Light We Cannot See. She puts it simply: portraying a blind character without agency who passively accepts other people's direction over her life sets a dangerous precedent. This all leads into the next portion of this discussion. The question of who can write what can often be paired with the idea of write what you know. In my opinion and or interpretation of these topics of debate, I tend to draw a line between these two. Write what you know, in my mind, applies to writing something sciencey without a science background. Who can write what is questioning if an older cis-white conservative man should really be writing about a young black queer woman. I see it as a difference between knowledge and identity. Further, who can write what is a question focused on marginalized identities and cultures. The question can narrow to something like, should someone not of this identity/culture be writing about a main character from that culture, especially when the identity/culture should or would be a larger part of that character's story and outlook on the world. Especially when the identities are not my own, I tend to look to others of those identities and cultures to listen to what they have to say to answer this question. This is the route I took with this book and this question, all of whom I've already quoted in the previous section. I mentioned who can write what can often come with the write what you know debate, because they bring up the same questions of, well, the writer should just do their research. Well, I answer that with, Doerr did do his research. The most critical of the book that I read, Wells-Jensen, acknowledged this. You can tell he did read about blindness. He read about Jacques Lucéron, a blind man who took part in the French resistance in World War II, and apparently also about Gerard Vermeil, a blind evolutionary biologist now at UC Davis, in what feels very much like a portrayal of the lively spirit that inspired and motivated M. Lucéron and Dr. Vermeil. All Marie inherited from these successful men was a degree of composure and an innocuous predilection for mollusks. His research didn't seem to help him with crafting a more accurate blind character. Those I read also did research on Doerr. Library of Dreaming specifically points out another book written by Doerr that falls into the same trappings of stereotypes and cliches for the disabled characters. This lends to another follow-up consideration with the who can write what question. A person will have biases and their own perspective on the world, whether they realize it or not, which will affect their writing. How Doerr's characters are written may reflect these, although I can't say for sure. Wells-Jensen remarks on this somewhat in her concluding statement. There's nothing pretty about the reality of prejudice, and there's nothing soft about the lives of disabled people who have been taught that they have neither the right nor the power to run their own lives. Art does matter because it not only reflects what we believe, it also helps to establish those beliefs. And if an artist is unsure how to authentically portray blind people, then it falls to the community to begin the conversation, because we do not have eyes like the egg cases of spiders. We can put on our own shoes, and we do, in fact, have reason to know what dancing is. Faerber also reflects, perhaps this is the most blind readers can hope from a sighted author. The question of who can write what is an open debate for a reason. Often we need to take it on a case-by-case basis, like I have done with this book. I want to leave you with some of the thoughts I had while going through all of this. I found myself trying to point out the good of the story, because I did enjoy it. There is something to be said about the way Doerr writes. But then, I stopped to think about how I would feel if any of my identities were portrayed in a way that felt so disingenuous and near insulting. Would I also throw away the book, even if the writing was undeniably beautiful? Probably. Thank you all for sticking with it. I know this was a little bit of a heftier conversation than the last one. I do want to say, even though this is aimed towards writers, this information and discussion is open to anyone, English class attendee or otherwise. All are welcome, just don't be mean. Also, I highly recommend reading those reviews by members of the blind community in Library of Dreaming, who's not blind but still part of the disability community. All is linked down in the description as per usual. And I do apologize if I butchered any of the French or non-English names. That's all I've got for now. On to the next book. Until then, pick up a pen and start reading.